Picture this: a young woman bent over a makeshift laboratory table, her hands glowing with an eerie green light from substances she doesn't yet know are slowly killing her. This isn't science fiction. This is the true story of Marie Curie, a woman whose love affair with both science and Pierre Curie would revolutionize our understanding of the universe, while simultaneously destroying her from the inside out. But here's what most people don't know about Marie Curie's story. Yes, she was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. Yes, she discovered radium and polonium. But beneath the textbook version lies a far more human tale of forbidden romance, devastating loss, and the ultimate sacrifice that would cost her everything, including her life. In this video, I'm going to reveal the untold story of Marie Curie that goes far beyond what you learned in school. We'll explore her passionate love story with Pierre that began with bicycles and ended in tragedy. We'll uncover her secret affair that nearly destroyed her reputation. And we'll witness how her groundbreaking discoveries came at a price so steep that even today, more than 90 years after her death, her personal belongings are still too radioactive to touch without protective gear. This isn't just the story of a brilliant scientist. This is the story of a woman who literally gave her life for the advancement of human knowledge and whose sacrifice continues to save lives to this very day. But to understand how Marie Curie became willing to make such an extraordinary sacrifice, we need to start at the beginning, in a place where education could cost you your freedom and where a young girl's dreams seemed impossible. The year is 1867, and in Russian-occupied Poland, speaking Polish in school could land you in prison. This was the world Marie Curie was born into. Though she wasn't Marie Curie yet, she was Maria Salomea Skłodowska, daughter of two Polish teachers living under one of the most oppressive regimes in Europe. Imagine growing up in a family where your parents lose job after job simply because they refuse to abandon their Polish heritage. The Skłodowski family moved from apartment to apartment, each one smaller than the last, as Maria's father struggled to find steady work under Russian rule. When Maria was just 8 years old, her oldest sister died of typhus. 3 years later, tuberculosis claimed her mother's life. At 11 years old, Maria had already learned that the world was a dangerous place where the things you love most can be ripped away without warning. But she also learned something else from her parents, something that would shape the rest of her life. Knowledge was the one thing no government, no tragedy, no force on earth could take from you. Here's where Maria's story takes an incredible turn. Despite being one of the brightest students in her class, despite graduating at just 15 with a gold medal, she couldn't attend university. Why? Because she was a woman, and the Russian Empire had banned women from higher education entirely. But Maria wasn't the type to accept defeat. Along with her sister Bronia, she joined Warsaw's Flying University, a secret network of scholars who moved from house to house, teaching banned subjects like Polish history and laboratory science. Picture this: young Polish students huddled in basements and attics, learning chemistry and physics by candlelight, knowing that discovery could mean exile to Siberia. This clandestine education was Maria's first taste of the radioactive world she would later inhabit, where knowledge was both precious and dangerous, where every discovery came with a risk. By age 24, Maria had saved enough money to leave Poland forever. She packed her belongings into a single suitcase and boarded a train to Paris, carrying nothing but her dreams and an unshakable belief that science could change the world. When she arrived at the Sorbonne, she was so unprepared for university life that she nearly froze during her first winter, surviving on bread and butter while studying physics in a 6th-floor garret. But Maria thrived on hardship. She graduated first in her physics degree and third in mathematics, proving that the girl who had been denied education could outperform students who had enjoyed every privilege. It was 1894 when Maria's life changed forever, though she didn't know it yet. She needed laboratory space for her research on the magnetic properties of steel, and a Polish physicist introduced her to someone who might help. His name was Pierre Curie. When Maria first saw Pierre, he was standing by a French window, and she was struck by something in his expression, a kind of detachment that mirrored her own dedication to science. Pierre was 35, 8 years older than Maria, and already an accomplished physicist. But there was something about this intense young Polish woman that captivated him completely. Their first conversations weren't about romance. They talked about magnetism, about crystals, about the fundamental forces that held the universe together. But as they spoke, something else was happening. Pierre was falling in love not just with Maria's brilliant mind, but with her absolute dedication to uncovering truth. The letters Pierre wrote to Maria during their courtship read like poetry, but poetry written by a scientist. "It would be a fine thing," he wrote, "a thing I hardly dare believe, to pass our lives near each other, hypnotized by our dreams, your patriotic dream, our humanitarian dream, and our scientific dream." This wasn't just a marriage proposal. This was a vision of two souls united by something bigger than themselves, a partnership that would quite literally change the world. But Maria hesitated. She had planned to return to Poland, to use her French education to help her homeland. Pierre's proposal meant abandoning that dream, choosing love over duty. For months, she wrestled with the decision while Pierre waited, writing letters that grew more passionate and desperate. When Maria finally said yes, she made a choice that revealed everything about her character. She chose to wear a dark blue dress for their wedding instead of traditional white, practical enough to serve later as a laboratory outfit. Even on her wedding day, Marie Curie was thinking about science. Their honeymoon was unlike anything you'd expect from two brilliant academics. Pierre and Marie packed their bicycles and toured the French countryside, stopping to collect mineral samples and discuss the latest discoveries in physics. Picture newlyweds pedaling through rural France, their panniers filled with rocks instead of romantic souvenirs. Their conversations focused on atomic structure rather than sweet nothings. But this wasn't a lack of romance. This was romance redefined. For Pierre and Marie Curie, sharing their passion for science was the deepest form of intimacy imaginable. When they returned to Paris, they set up their laboratory in an abandoned shed that had once housed a medical school's dissection room. The roof leaked, the floor was dirt, and in winter it was so cold their breath formed clouds as they worked. But they didn't care. They had each other, they had their research, and they were about to make discoveries that would earn them immortality. What they didn't know was that their groundbreaking work would also slowly kill them both. In 1896, a French physicist named Henri Becquerel made a startling discovery. Uranium salts could fog photographic plates, even in complete darkness, suggesting they emitted some kind of invisible radiation. Most scientists found this mildly interesting and moved on. But Marie Curie saw something different. She saw a mystery that demanded solving. Marie decided to make this mysterious radiation the subject of her doctoral thesis. Using an electrometer invented by Pierre and his brother, she began measuring the intensity of radiation from different uranium compounds. What she discovered would revolutionize physics. The radiation wasn't affected by the chemical form of the uranium. It didn't matter whether she used uranium oxide or uranium sulfate. The intensity of radiation depended only on the quantity of uranium present. This meant the radiation was an atomic property, something fundamental to the uranium atom itself. But then Marie made an even more shocking discovery. When she tested pitchblende, a uranium ore, she found it was 4 times more radioactive than pure uranium. This should have been impossible. If uranium was the source of radiation, then pure uranium should be the most radioactive substance possible, unless there was something else in the pitchblende, something far more radioactive than uranium. Pierre abandoned his own research on crystals to join his wife's investigation. Together, they began processing tons of pitchblende in their freezing shed, stirring massive vats of boiling ore with iron rods nearly as tall as they were. They were searching for elements that existed in such tiny quantities that no chemist had ever detected them before. What they found would make them famous, win them Nobel Prizes, and ultimately kill them both. But that's where our story takes its first dark turn, because the substances Pierre and Marie Curie were discovering were beautiful, mysterious, and absolutely lethal. The work was backbreaking and dangerous in ways they couldn't imagine. Picture this. Marie and Pierre spent their days grinding tons of pitchblende ore by hand, stirring enormous vats of boiling radioactive sludge with iron rods. The shed had no ventilation system, no safety equipment, no protection whatsoever from the invisible forces they were unleashing. Their hands began to crack and blister from constant exposure to radioactive materials. Pierre deliberately exposed his arm to radium to study its effects, creating a lesion that took months to heal. They both started experiencing constant fatigue, aching bones, and a persistent weakness that they attributed to overwork. But here's the truly haunting part. They found the work beautiful. Marie would later write about returning to their laboratory at night, marveling at the test tubes and beakers that glowed with an ethereal blue-green light. She kept radioactive samples in her desk drawer and carried them in her pockets, fascinated by their mysterious luminescence. They had no idea they were slowly poisoning themselves with every breath, every touch, every moment spent in that contaminated shed. After 3 years of crushing, boiling, and crystallizing pitchblende, Marie and Pierre finally isolated 1/10 of a gram of pure radium chloride. It was a triumph beyond imagination. They had discovered not one but 2 new elements: polonium, named after Marie's beloved homeland, and radium, which glowed like captured starlight. The scientific community was stunned. Marie had proven that atoms weren't indivisible building blocks as everyone believed, but complex structures capable of spontaneous transformation. She coined the term radioactivity to describe this phenomenon, fundamentally changing how humanity understood matter itself. In 1903, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences made history. Marie Curie became the first woman ever awarded a Nobel Prize, sharing the honor in physics with Pierre and Henri Becquerel. But even this moment of triumph revealed the era's prejudices. The committee initially planned to honor only Pierre and Becquerel, completely ignoring Marie's contributions. It was Pierre himself who insisted his wife's name be added, threatening to refuse the prize unless Marie received equal recognition. Their success brought fame, money, and opportunities neither had dreamed possible. Universities competed to hire them, laboratories offered them positions, and suddenly the couple who had worked in a freezing shed became scientific celebrities. But fame came with a price Marie hadn't anticipated. Their laboratory became a tourist attraction, with visitors constantly interrupting their work to gawk at the famous couple. Journalists pestered them for interviews. Society hostesses demanded their presence at dinner parties, and the quiet life of research they cherished was shattered forever. Even worse, the constant exposure to radiation was taking its toll. Both Pierre and Marie suffered from what they called radium fatigue. Pierre's hands were so damaged he could barely dress himself. Marie experienced severe anemia and constant exhaustion. They didn't understand that radiation was attacking their bone marrow, destroying their blood cells, slowly killing them from the inside. Then tragedy struck with devastating suddenness. On the 19th of April 1906, Pierre was walking across a busy Paris street, lost in thought as he often was. The rain made the cobblestones slippery, and Pierre, weakened by years of radiation exposure, lost his footing. A horse-drawn wagon couldn't stop in time. Marie Curie, one half of the most famous scientific partnership in history, was killed instantly. Marie's world collapsed. The man who had been her husband, her collaborator, her soulmate for 11 years was gone. She was 38 years old, left to raise their 2 young daughters alone, while carrying on research that had already claimed her husband and was slowly killing her too. But Marie Curie had learned something from those early years in Poland, from losing her mother and sister, from fighting for education in a world that denied her opportunities. She had learned that grief, no matter how overwhelming, could not be allowed to stop the work. 5 months after Pierre's death, Marie did something unprecedented. She accepted the University of Paris's offer to take over Pierre's teaching position, becoming the first woman professor in the institution's 650-year history. When she delivered her first lecture, the amphitheater was packed with curious spectators who had come to see if the grieving widow could fill her famous husband's shoes. Marie walked to the podium and began speaking in a clear, steady voice, picking up Pierre's course exactly where he had left off. She didn't acknowledge the crowd, didn't mention her loss, didn't seek sympathy. She simply taught physics with the same brilliant clarity that had made Pierre famous. The audience was stunned. This wasn't a broken woman seeking pity. This was a scientist determined to honor her husband by continuing their shared mission of understanding the universe. But Marie's greatest challenges were still ahead. In 1910, she succeeded in isolating pure metallic radium, finally proving beyond doubt that her discoveries were real. This achievement earned her a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, making her the first person in history to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences. Yet, just as Marie reached the pinnacle of scientific achievement, her personal life exploded into scandal that threatened to destroy everything she had built. The man's name was Paul Langevin, a brilliant physicist who had been Pierre's student. 4 years younger than Marie, married with 4 children, Paul began collaborating with the famous Madame Curie on research projects. Professional respect turned to friendship, then to something deeper and more dangerous. Marie, lonely and still grieving after 5 years of widowhood, found herself falling in love again. But this time, her choice would nearly cost her everything. Their affair began innocently enough, with long conversations about science and life. But Paul was trapped in an unhappy marriage, and Marie was the most famous woman in France. When their relationship became romantic, it created a scandal that would shake the very foundations of French society. The French press, always eager for sensational stories, turned Marie's private life into front-page news. Headlines screamed about the foreign Jewish homewrecker destroying a French family, playing on both anti-Semitic and xenophobic prejudices. Never mind that Marie wasn't Jewish, the newspapers didn't care about accuracy when scandal sold more copies. Angry mobs gathered outside Marie's home, shouting, "Down with the foreigner!" Windows were broken, death threats arrived daily, and Marie's daughters had to be escorted to school under police protection. The woman who had revolutionized science was now being vilified as a threat to French moral values. Einstein himself wrote to Marie during this dark period, "If the rabble continues to occupy itself with you, then simply don't read that hogwash, but rather leave it to the reptile for whom it has been fabricated." But the damage was devastating. Marie's health, already compromised by radiation exposure, deteriorated under the stress. Then came news that should have been triumphant. Marie was awarded her second Nobel Prize. But the Swedish Academy, bowing to public pressure, suggested she might want to stay home rather than accept the honor in person. They were essentially asking her to hide in shame rather than celebrate her scientific achievements. Marie's response revealed everything about her character. She traveled to Stockholm, accepted her Nobel Prize with dignity, and delivered a lecture that focused entirely on her scientific work. She refused to be ashamed of her personal choices or to let scandal diminish her professional accomplishments. But the affair with Langevin was over, destroyed by public scrutiny and personal anguish. Paul returned to his wife and children, leaving Marie to face the future alone once again. What happened next would show the world that Marie Curie's greatest discoveries weren't made in a laboratory, but on the battlefields of World War I. When World War I erupted across Europe in 1914, most scientists retreated to their laboratories, content to let others fight while they pursued their research. But Marie Curie saw something different in the chaos. She saw an opportunity to prove that science wasn't just about abstract theories and academic glory, but about saving human lives. The problem was immediate and deadly. Soldiers were dying not just from enemy bullets, but from infections and internal injuries that field surgeons couldn't properly diagnose. X-ray machines existed, but they were massive, stationary devices found only in major city hospitals, hundreds of miles from the front lines where men lay bleeding in makeshift field hospitals. Most people would have seen this as an impossible challenge. Marie Curie saw it as a puzzle to solve. Working with almost manic determination, she designed something the world had never seen before, a mobile X-ray unit that could be driven directly to the battlefield. These weren't just X-ray machines on wheels. Marie had to solve complex engineering problems that would have stumped teams of specialists. How do you generate enough electricity to power an X-ray machine in the middle of a battlefield? Marie's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. She incorporated a dynamo into the car's design, allowing the petroleum engine to generate the necessary electrical power. How do you develop photographs in a moving vehicle? She created a complete darkroom setup that could function in the back of a truck bouncing over crater-filled roads. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Marie Curie, the most famous scientist in the world, didn't just design these mobile X-ray units from the comfort of her laboratory. She taught herself to drive. She learned automotive repair. She personally drove these machines to the front lines, often under enemy fire, to X-ray wounded soldiers herself. Picture this: a 50-year-old woman who had spent her life in laboratories, crawling under military trucks to repair engines, changing tires on muddy battlefields, and calmly taking X-rays while artillery shells exploded in the distance. The soldiers called her units petites Curies, little Curies, and the name stuck. Marie's teenage daughter, Irene, joined her mother's mission, becoming one of the youngest X-ray technicians in history. Together, they trained over 150 women in radiology, anatomy, automotive repair, and photographic processing. These weren't just nurses learning basic first aid. Marie was creating an army of skilled technicians who could operate complex medical equipment under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. By war's end, Marie's mobile X-ray units had examined over 1 million wounded soldiers. Think about that number. 1 million men who might have died from undiagnosed internal injuries were saved because Marie Curie refused to let war stop her from using science to heal. But this humanitarian triumph came at a devastating personal cost. Marie spent 4 years breathing in the fumes from photographic chemicals, handling X-ray equipment with no radiation protection, and exposing herself to massive doses of radiation as she personally operated the machines. She was already suffering from radiation poisoning from her years of radium research. The war work accelerated her decline dramatically. Her hands, already scarred and burned from handling radioactive materials, became so damaged she could barely use them. Her energy, once boundless, began to fade. The woman who had once worked 18-hour days in her laboratory now struggled to climb stairs. But Marie kept working. When the war ended, she didn't retire to recover her health. Instead, she threw herself into her most ambitious project yet, creating a world-class laboratory that would train the next generation of scientists in the safe handling of radioactive materials. Here's the tragic irony. Marie Curie, who had unknowingly poisoned herself through years of unprotected work with radium, became one of the first advocates for radiation safety. She implemented blood testing for laboratory workers, insisted on proper ventilation systems, and demanded that only trained personnel handle radioactive materials. She was trying to protect others from the fate she knew awaited her. In 1921, American women raised money to buy Marie a gram of radium for her research. When she traveled to the United States to accept this gift, journalists were shocked by her appearance. The vibrant woman who had once worked tirelessly in her laboratory was now frail, nearly blind from cataracts caused by radiation exposure, and so weak she could barely speak above a whisper. But when Marie addressed the crowd in New York, her message was clear and urgent. I particularly would stress the fact that radium is dangerous in untrained hands. She knew she was dying from her own discoveries, but she was determined to prevent others from suffering the same fate. The final years of Marie's life were a race against time. Her body was failing, but her mind remained sharp, focused on one last crucial mission. Working with doctors, she helped develop new techniques for using radiation to treat cancer. The same force that was killing her could also save lives, if properly controlled and carefully applied. Marie's laboratory became a center for cancer research, training doctors from around the world in the safe use of radioactive materials for medical treatment. She was literally turning her own slow death into a weapon against the disease that claimed so many lives. But by 1934, Marie's body could no longer fight the effects of decades of radiation exposure. Her bone marrow, destroyed by years of absorbing radioactive particles, could no longer produce the blood cells necessary for life. She developed aplastic anemia, a condition where the body simply stops making enough healthy blood cells to survive. Even as she lay dying, Marie remained fascinated by the science of her own condition. She discussed her symptoms with doctors, analyzed her blood test results, and tried to understand exactly how radiation was shutting down her body's vital systems. She was a scientist to the end, studying death itself with the same curiosity she had once brought to studying radium. On the 4th of July 1934, Marie Curie died at a sanatorium in the French Alps. She was 66 years old, and her last words were about her work, about the research she would never complete, about the mysteries she would never solve. But death couldn't stop the radioactive legacy Marie Curie had created, literally and figuratively. When authorities examined her body for burial, they made a disturbing discovery. Marie's corpse was still radioactive. The radium and other radioactive elements she had absorbed over decades of unprotected research were still emitting dangerous levels of radiation. She had to be buried in a lead-lined coffin to protect the living from the dead. Today, more than 90 years after her death, Marie Curie's personal belongings remain too dangerous to handle without protective equipment. Her laboratory notebooks, her cookbooks, even her furniture continues to emit radiation. Visitors to France's National Library who want to see her research notes must sign liability waivers and wear protective clothing, because the pages are still contaminated with radium-226. Scientists estimate that Marie's notebooks will remain dangerously radioactive for another 1,500 years. She didn't just give her life to science, she gave her death to it as well, becoming a permanent reminder of both the power and the peril of the forces she unleashed. But Marie's true legacy isn't measured in radiation levels or safety protocols. It's measured in the lives saved by the medical techniques she pioneered, the women inspired by her example, and the fundamental understanding of atomic structure that grew from her discoveries. Her daughter Irene followed in her mother's footsteps, winning a Nobel Prize for discovering artificial radioactivity. Like her mother, Irene died from radiation exposure, succumbing to leukemia in 1956. The Curie family paid the ultimate price for their contributions to science, sacrificing their lives so that humanity could understand the invisible forces that govern our universe. Today, as cancer patients receive radiation therapy, as doctors use radioactive tracers to diagnose disease, as nuclear power plants generate clean energy, Marie Curie's sacrifice continues to save lives around the world. She gave everything so that we might harness the atom's power for good rather than destruction. But there's one final twist to Marie's story that reveals just how extraordinary her sacrifice truly was. Modern scientists who have studied Marie's remains discovered something remarkable. When her body was moved to the Pantheon in 1995, nearly 60 years after her death, they expected to find massive radiation contamination. Instead, they found something that changed everything we thought we knew about her final years. Marie's body contained far less radium contamination than anyone anticipated. The deadly levels of radiation that should have been present simply weren't there. This wasn't because the radioactivity had faded over time. Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. The absence of internal contamination meant something else entirely. Marie Curie hadn't died from radium poisoning as everyone believed. She had died from the X-ray work during World War I. Think about what this means. Marie knew, better than anyone alive, how dangerous radium could be. She had watched it burn her hands, weaken her body, and slowly destroy her health. But when war came, when soldiers were dying because doctors couldn't see their internal injuries, she made a conscious choice. She chose to expose herself to even more radiation, not for scientific discovery this time, but to save lives. Marie Curie literally sacrificed her remaining years of life to heal strangers on a battlefield. This revelation transforms our understanding of Marie's final sacrifice. She wasn't a reckless scientist who ignored safety precautions. She was a woman who calculated the cost of her actions and decided that saving lives was worth dying for. But the story becomes even more profound when you realize what Marie was fighting against in her final years. As her health deteriorated, as her energy faded, as her body slowly shut down, she faced a choice that would define her legacy forever. She could have retreated into comfortable obscurity, spending her remaining time with family, writing memoirs, accepting honorary degrees from universities around the world. No one would have blamed her. She had already accomplished more than any scientist in history. Instead, Marie chose to spend her final years training the next generation of researchers in radiation safety. She established protocols that are still used today. She insisted on blood tests, protective equipment, and proper ventilation systems that would prevent others from suffering her fate. Marie Curie was literally dying from radiation exposure while simultaneously creating the safety standards that would protect future scientists from radiation exposure. She was solving her own murder while it was happening. The woman who had once marveled at glowing test tubes, who had carried radioactive samples in her pockets like beautiful jewels, who had stirred tons of pitchblende with her bare hands, spent her final years warning others about the very dangers that were killing her. This wasn't guilt or regret driving her actions. Marie never expressed regret about her discoveries. This was something far more powerful: responsibility. She understood that knowledge without wisdom was dangerous, that power without understanding could destroy rather than heal. In her final public speech in New York, Marie's words carried the weight of someone who knew she was speaking from her deathbed. The study of radium has been the basis of the new science of radioactivity, but we must never forget that its practical applications depend entirely on the wisdom with which we use this knowledge. She was talking about more than laboratory safety. She was talking about the moral obligation that comes with scientific discovery, the responsibility to ensure that knowledge serves humanity rather than destroying it. Marie's final years were spent in a race against time, not to make new discoveries, but to ensure her existing discoveries would be used wisely. She collaborated with doctors to develop safer radiation therapy techniques. She trained researchers from around the world in proper safety protocols. She established laboratories that would continue her work without repeating her mistakes. Even as her vision failed from cataracts, even as her hands became too damaged to hold laboratory equipment, even as her energy disappeared and her blood failed to carry oxygen to her organs, Marie continued working, not for fame, not for prizes, not for recognition, but for the simple belief that knowledge belonged to humanity, not to individuals. When Marie died on that July morning in 1934, she left behind more than scientific discoveries. She left behind a model of how scientists should think about their responsibilities to the world. Her life proved that the greatest discoveries come not from brilliant minds working in isolation, but from passionate individuals willing to sacrifice everything for the advancement of human knowledge. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Marie's legacy is how her sacrifice continues to multiply across generations. Every cancer patient who receives radiation therapy benefits from techniques Marie helped develop. Every scientist who works safely with radioactive materials is protected by protocols Marie established. Every woman who pursues a career in science walks a path Marie carved with her own hands. Marie Curie's story teaches us that the greatest human achievements aren't measured by the honors we receive, but by the sacrifices we're willing to make for future generations. She gave her life not once, but twice. First for discovery, then for the wisdom to use that discovery safely. Her legacy glows eternal, proving that love, whether for science or humanity, is the most powerful force in the universe.